you that don't know me, I spent almost 34 years as the maple specialist for the Vermont Agency of Agriculture. And in that period of time, I never had a producer call me and say, I'm making the best maple syrup I ever made, come and taste it. They'd always call and say, something's wrong with my syrup, come and try it. So I had the experience of tasting a lot of off-flavored syrup. Have been in the hospital 3 times tasting syrup, mainly due to chemicals. I wouldn't recommend that for anyone, but sometimes you have to do whatever you can to try to help people produce the best product they can. So anyway, through that period of time, we decided that we should come up with some way to try to help producers identify some off flavors if they hit it. There's usually 2 ways that off flavors come about in syrup. One is something that we do to the syrup and it affects the flavor. And then Mother Nature can affect the syrup. And there's not much we can do about that, but we need to recognize either one. So what I'd like to do is just go through this handout that you have. You can follow along or not, whichever way, and just go over some of the off flavors. And again, this is some of the off flavors that we have encountered over the years. The first one is chlorine or sodium. That usually came about from people using bleach to rinse their pipelines. Back in the old days, they didn't rinse them with water after that. So you had a buildup of the salts in the chlorine inside the plastic tubing. And what would happen is the next year when the sap came through the tubing, it would kind of scrub the tubing. And you'd get a varying degree of sodium in the flavor of the syrup. When you taste a syrup that has been affected by that, your tongue will water excessively. It will be a big watering, almost as if you're drinking a glass of water. It can be slight, or depending on how much sodium there is, it can be quite extensive. The worst case we ever saw of this was back in the 80s. There was a chemistry professor that also was a sugar maker, and he decided the best way to keep his tubing system sanitary was to plug the spouts and leave a chlorine solution in it all summer. The first syrup he made the next year, you had to spit out. It was horrible. The last syrup he made was horrible. He ended up losing an entire crop of syrup, and he had to replace every bit of tubing. You just couldn't get that chlorine out of the tubing. So nowadays, most people don't use chlorine. You use just either hot water or some other type of thing, but the main thing to remember is if you clean your tubing, make sure it's rinsed properly. Detergents is another off flavor. You really shouldn't use a regular detergent in anything to do with maple. Detergents either have a soapy film or sometimes they have some kind of an odor. Pine, lemon, something like that would affect the syrup. Again, if you taste it, you may get a soapy taste to it, or you may pick up those fragrances that are in that syrup. Again, as Kathy said, I like to tell stories, but back in the late 80s, we were doing a bulk syrup grading, and we hit a barrel of syrup you could almost blow bubbles with. Really horrible. The producer was a small producer, but he finally admitted that he had just buckets, and he'd washed his buckets the summer before in ivory dish liquid and cold water, and he hadn't rinsed them out. And even though they sat for the entire summer, fall, into the spring, when the sap dripped in those buckets, it pulled that soap film out of the buckets and right into his syrup. And it was pretty bad in that one. Rust preventative paints is another one. We don't see that much anymore. When lead became an issue in the maple industry back in the 90s, in the testing we did, we found that a lot of people were painting galvanized buckets and galvanized holding tanks. And the paint they were using, come to find out, was never really meant for long-term use. It was meant for incidental contact, which means you could paint a table, and if it touched it, it would be all right. But it wasn't meant to have sap stored in it. If these paints didn't cure well, when you tasted the syrup, you had almost a fish oil or a fishy taste to it. It was just because of the base in the rust preventative paints that affected the flavor of the syrup. There are a couple paints that are available nowadays. They're two-part epoxies, but you have to be very careful how you do it, and the temperature has to be right. So nowadays, most people have gone to stainless steel, which is a great thing, or plastic. And you shouldn't hit this kind of a flavor these days. Metallic is the next flavor. We used to get this from metal syrup cans that if you put syrup in it after a period of time, you could pick up this metallic off flavor. And the metallic off flavor will affect your tongue. It's a sharp feeling on the sides of your tongue, almost as if it wants to water, but it doesn't. If it's bad enough, it tastes really tinny. It tastes like an old tin can. What was happening was these cans, when they were first made years ago, they used what they called pound tin plating, which means they put a pound of tin over a 10 by 10 sheet of steel. As time went on, they went to quarter pound tin plating. So it was only a quarter pound of tin over this steel. And what happened, it didn't cover it well. So if you ever in the past have opened the top of a metal syrup can and seen black around the rim, that syrup can is actually detinning. It's actually losing the metal, and you're going to be tasting it. Most of the cans nowadays are epoxy lined. There should be no problem with that. Years ago, we did run into a problem with some cans that were made. We had a call from a producer that said he was getting a terrible odor in his new cans. And we checked it out, and there was quite an odor. We had it tested at the health department, and we found that the cans were contaminated with benzene and naphthalene. And we found out they were being made in China. So when we went to the warehouse, all of the cases in the warehouse were properly marked product of China, but the seller of the cans were covering that with stickers that said play it safe, pack in tin, or syrup in tin, no harmful chemicals. And the reason he did that, he said, was who wants to buy cans from China? So anyway, he was stopped from distributing cans for many years. As I said, nowadays the cans are pretty good shape. Where we're getting a metallic off flavor now in syrup is from epoxy barrels where the epoxy inside has cracked and exposing the steel. If you use an epoxy lined barrel and there's any dents in it or anything, you have to make sure that that epoxy isn't broken. And it will pick up a metallic off flavor very quickly in that. Plastic off flavor, we don't hit much anymore. The only time we hit it now is if somebody uses a plastic container that really wasn't meant for food use. I know in Vermont, we have several enterprising people that like to use some used plastic barrels for stations in the woods for their tubing. I went by one place this year that had several barrels out, and they all had the skull and crossbones on them. They were chemical barrels. Not a good idea to use that. A plastic off flavor, if your syrup picks that up, it's almost a bittersweet flavor. It's basically was plastic that was never meant for hot syrup packing, and it will sort of melt the plastic into the syrup. Filters, Mark mentioned filters and cleaning them. New filters, they have a very chemical odor and taste to them. We always recommended putting them in a pot with clear water on the kitchen stove, get them to a boil, rinse them well before you use them. previously used filters, especially the hat or cone type filters or filters that require gravity, when you get ready to store them for the summer, it's important that they be very dry. What can happen is if there's any moisture in those filters, they will produce a mold. It's hard to see in that kind of whitish filter. And if you run hot syrup through a moldy filter, you're going to get a very musty off flavor, very moldy off flavor. The other thing that I know in Vermont that producers used to do was they'd bring the filters home at night and throw them in the clothes washing machine. Even though you don't put in ivory snow or anything like that with it, you're still going to pick up very possibly a detergent off flavor. So it's better not to do that. Better just to use clear water and make sure that you rinse them well afterwards and dry them. Defoamers is a problem that we have nowadays, probably as much as any other off flavor. The defoamers that are commercially available shouldn't be a problem. What happens is people use other things. When I first started work 34 years ago, I went to a sugar house. The back pan boiled up and the producer grabbed a piece of balsam brush and stuck in the back pan. Any of you that have ever cut Christmas trees or done anything with wreaths, around Christmas time, that's a really nice smell, but let me tell you, it doesn't do a thing for the flavor of maple syrup. We saw people use peanut butter. It's very oily, it drops the foam down, but it gives you an off flavor to the syrup. Plus, nowadays, with people's allergen reactions, you don't want to keep peanut butter anywhere near syrup. Probably the worst one I ever saw was there was a dairy farmer that headed to the sugar house one day, and at that time he was using butter for a defoamer, but he forgot his butter that day. So he had a grease gun with him that he'd used to grease the manure spreader, and he hung it over the back pan with the tip down so it would, when it foamed up, it would hit the tip. And this was a sugar house open to the public. So if you were a consumer and you went into a sugar house, how much syrup would you buy if you saw a manure-covered grease gun hanging over the back pan? He didn't do that anymore. We had the inspector from FDA stop by and had a talk with him. He was just not thinking about it. That's one of the problems that we have with maple syrup is people think, well, I boil it. What can possibly be wrong? So people use things like that. But nowadays, they also use organic defoamers. Organic is a great thing for maple, but the oils that are used, the canola, safflower, things like that, you have to use them with care. I was called out the last of my working to a sugar house that had an off flavor problem. I tasted his syrup. It was a defoamer off flavor. There were 23 empty quart canola oil bottles on his shelf. He said he was using almost a quart of canola oil a night in his evaporator. This is just way too much. When you taste a syrup that has been contaminated with defoamer, you run your tongue on the roof of your mouth. It's an oily or waxy feeling. With the organic defoamers, people get different reactions. I tend to get, with canola oil, a walnut taste in the back of my mouth. With safflower oil, I get a spicy feeling on the sides of my tongue. Just something different on the sides of my tongue. But basically, you want to use as little as possible, just enough to control the foam, but not to affect the flavor. Chemicals, that's been one of the things that I ran into problems with. The last time I was in the hospital, I was called to Maple Grove Farms in St. Johnsbury to taste some syrup that came in. The syrup had a chemical off flavor. The only trouble with my old position was you tried to help people by telling me exactly what it was. So I probably tasted more than I should have. Couldn't figure out exactly what the chemical was. So I drove back to my office in Montpelier, Vermont, which is about half an hour away. And by the time I got to the office, I was the color of a boiled lobster and I couldn't breathe. So I went to the hospital, and come to find out, the producer, in trying to do a really good job, had washed his RO filters with sodium hydroxide, which is a normal thing, but he used way too much. But being a frugal Vermonter, he saved his wash water to clean the evaporator. Someone told him if he ran muriatic acid through the filters, that it would tighten them up. I don't know who did that, but muriatic acid is paint remover, basically. It has skull and crossbones on it. But again, he saved the wash water to clean his evaporator. And he was cleaning his evaporator every day with 5 gallons of phosphoric acid. He had an air system in the evaporator, which of course you're not running when you're cleaning it. So that liquid that he was putting in the evaporator settled in those little pipes, and when he flooded it with sap and turned the air system on, it blew it right into the sap. So I made it out of there okay. It was a little touch and go for a bit, but it made us realize that there's a lot of powerful chemicals being used in the maple industry nowadays, and there wasn't a lot of direction. So that spurred myself and the Proctor Center here to work on a chemical safety brochure, which I hope everyone has. A chemical off flavor will taste like chemical. That's all I can tell you. My advice is, if you taste something that is like that, don't keep tasting it. That's probably not a good thing. But it's, you know, you have to, the chemicals you use, you have to know how to use them properly, store them properly, and dispose of the wash water properly. So it's, there's a lot of things out there nowadays. Lubricants and fuels. You wouldn't think this would be an issue with the industry. Years ago, I went to a sugar house. The guy's syrup tasted like diesel fuel, slightly like diesel fuel. Couldn't really figure it out until we went out back, and he had an old sugar house that had a lean-to in the back for his sap tank. It was up on a platform, but he had extra room there, so he parked his tractor under there. So his standard practice was to get there in the morning. He had buckets. He'd start the tractor before he went together, and he'd go do stuff in the sugar house. Well, all of the fumes from the exhaust were hitting the roof and going right into the sap. The sap was purple in color. Just something he did himself to the syrup. Did hit one a couple of years ago where, again, at Maple Grove, you'd think after all these years I wouldn't go there to taste syrup, but they called me, and they had 5 barrels of syrup, and when you tasted it, you tasted diesel fuel, and I mean strong diesel fuel. Come to find out, the producer was a contractor that ran out of barrels at the end of sugaring, and he emptied 5 55-gallon barrels of diesel fuel, and for some reason did not rinse them out. So I actually had diesel fuel in the syrup. And one of the stories I won't tell you today, but I think I know where one of the barrels went, and it has to do with some guy putting syrup in his hot tub. So we'll leave that one alone. Musty syrup comes about 2 different ways. One is if you have containers that aren't sealed well, you can get mold formed. You taste the syrup, you get a musty off flavor. It used to be that containers would say, if you find mold, skim it off, reheat it, you'll be fine. Nowadays, with the allergen risk, if you see mold in syrup, just get rid of it. It's not worth the risk. The other way that you can get musty syrup, as I said, was from those filters that have mold in them. You run hot syrup through, you'll pick up a musty off flavor. And the musty off flavor, the best description is moldy. It tastes moldy. It tastes almost like a wet dirt floored basement smells. It's a kind of an irritating flavor. Ferment comes about 2 different ways also. One is if you don't concentrate your sugar in your sap enough, make the density heavy enough, your syrup will actually work like an apple cider. And I've actually seen jugs blow apart on store shelves because it fermented so badly. The other way you can get fermented syrup is if you put hot syrup in a dirty barrel. And years ago, we tested some barrels of syrup. If you send your barrels to a packer, they usually steam clean them, put them in a pile, waiting for you to take them back. There's always still some moisture left in the barrels. So what we did was we took that moisture out of the barrels and we tested it in our lab, and it went off the scale in yeast, mold, and bacteria. So it's really important with those barrels when you get them back before you fill them with syrup to make sure that you wash them with hot water before you use them. The ferment taste, it tastes really sickening sweet. It may taste a little bit like a honey, a little honey flavor to it. If you look at it, it can be bubbly, can have foam in it, and that again, that's those two different ways from that you get an off flavor from ferment. Sour sap, basically syrup made from sap that probably should have been thrown away. We have a lot of people that kind of hate the in-sugaring. They want to keep going and making syrup, make some money. When it warms up, especially with pipeline systems, the sap begins to almost be viscous. And if it starts to spoil and you make it into syrup, your syrup is going to be ropey and has a very sour flavor. And you, again, may get that viscous flavor on your tongue. Burnt niter is a combination off flavor. When niter builds up in the evaporator, as you saw with Mark's presentation, there's kind of a layer on the pan. That actually can lift up a little bit and you get some liquid below it and actually burns on the pan. So you get a niter off flavor, which is actually a baking soda effect on your tongue. If you taste a syrup that has niter in it, your tongue will sizzle, almost like an Alka-Seltzer tablet. Then you get the burned flavor from burned niter. So you can get a niter off flavor by itself, but if you get a burned niter, it has that burned flavor with it. Scorch is basically when you burn the syrup on the pan, and that is just a burned flavor to the syrup. You don't get any of that niter feel to it. The earthy flavor, which hopefully none of you will ever see. I've seen it 3 times in Vermont over the years. It's when you tap into bad wood, dark wood, punky wood, things like that. The moisture that comes into the lines picks up some stuff from that. And to me, it tastes like garden soil. It's really, really a strange off flavor. The worst one I ever saw, a person had some high school kids tap trees, didn't tell them how to do it. They tapped right close to the old tap holes, and evidently there was enough transpiration of moisture in there. His whole crop just had that dirt flavor to it, and he didn't have a very big crop either, because you get a lot less sap from taps that are put in wrong. Then we get into a couple Mother Nature off flavors, and again, there's not much you can do about this. It's something that we have to realize what it is and know how to deal with the syrup. Metabolism, or woody, is the first one, and that comes about whenever it warms up during the sugaring season or just before. The syrup doesn't have any good maple flavor. You taste it, it really doesn't have a maple flavor. I call it a cardboard effect to the syrup. Dr. Morcelli, that used to be the researcher here at UVM, called it a dry popcorn flavor. It can be from very mild to quite irritating, actually. But you don't have the good maple flavor, and you have this kind of cardboard feel to the syrup. If the weather gets cold again, you can lose it, and you might not have it again. It's what we call the pre-bud stage. It's due to the, I guess, the phenols in the trees uh, that build up, and uh, not much we can do about it. It's what the weather conditions affect the syrup. The other Mother Nature off flavor that we get is buddy, and buddy usually comes at the end of sugaring. It's when the trees are beginning to think about producing buds, and you get this basically Tootsie Roll or chocolatey off flavor to the syrup. It can smell. You can smell it sometimes. It smells chocolatey. Um, it's again, you can have varying degrees of it. It can be from very light to very heavy. Um, the thing with these Mother Nature off flavors, if you heat them to can them, it's just going to get worse. There are things you can do with these. If you made dry sugar out of them, theoretically, you heat it enough to be able to use it for producing sugar, and you lose that flavor. That's questionable sometimes, but at least you can try that if you wanted to. But the main thing is you can't really make it into a product like a cream or a candy because it will just intensify the flavor. You don't heat it enough to get rid of it. So these are the kind of standard off flavors that we've run into. I mean, by no means all the off flavors. We have very, very many. I will, before we go into questions, I will leave you with one last story. About a year before I got done work, I had a prominent sugar maker in Vermont that brought me in a quart of syrup. And he said that he just had it returned from a consumer, and the guy said he couldn't get it to pour. And he said, I can't get it to pour either. I have no idea what's wrong with it. So he left it, and at that time I had a little lab downstairs in the basement of the ag building. I took it down there, and I couldn't pour it, but I manipulated it enough to get some liquid out, which of course I tasted because I taste everything. And it had these odd fibers and seeds in it, and I couldn't figure out what it was. So I took a colander and I shook the jug until this mass just blopped out into the colander. Still had no idea what it was. I took some water and washed it off, and then I realized what happened. What had happened is an enterprising mouse had taken yellow insulation and packed in that jug before he packed it, and those were not little seeds I was eating. When I told the producer about it, he got pretty white, and evidently he'd left some jugs out. He'd been using some a few days before and just hadn't taken care of them like he should, and evidently didn't do a good job of checking his empty jugs before he packed it. And I think it was a good thing the consumer didn't know what it was, and I did win an award for my division for eating mouse crap, so that was good too. So anyway, enough stories. Any questions on these off flavors?
Any questions? Yes, there's one. Where's the microphone? Oh, there.
You were mentioning about the deformer.
Yes.
Someone had put too much deformer in the syrup. But what was the quantity of syrup? Like when we were talking about a quart of syrup for his day, what was the amount of syrup produced that day? Was it 100,000 tap?
No. Yeah, this was a small to medium producer that was probably making about 40 gallons of syrup a day.
Okay.
And he used an entire quart of canola oil. And that was a really bad one. What happens a lot of times with the organic defoamers, People put them in the pan. They foam, it doesn't drop the foam down immediately like the commercial defoamers, and they get nervous and they put more and more, and then they get a little too much in there.
Okay, perfect, thanks.
Sure.
Any other questions?
Kind of got thought about what we were talking about yesterday.
Hey, Henry.
Have you ever been called in if there's like a discrepancy with the buyer as far as what an off flavor might be or things like that? Do they ever consult with you on, the discrepancy between the buyer and the producer?
Yes, at times I was over the years. Normally, they can work it out, but once in a while, there was a situation or two where the producer was not accepting the fact, I guess, that he had an off flavor, and they wanted a third party to come in and just verify that there was an off flavor to the syrup. Depending on what the off flavor is, a lot of the buyers will take it. Of course, they'll pay you a lot less, but over the years, there were a few times that I was.
Anything else? Yes.
About chlorine.
Yep.
Some buyers are supplying plastic barrels, and they say they can be washed with chlorine and rinse 2 or 3 times. Do you recommend that?
Well, you probably can do that. I don't recommend it myself because I've seen just what a small residue of chlorine can do for an off flavor. And it's really hard to make sure you get everything out. I would rather see just good hot water used in cleaning that. Again, really good rinsing should take care of the problem, but it's a concern sometimes. Chlorine will give you an off flavor if there's any left in there.
Anything else? You can't wait to start tasting off-flavored syrup, can you?
I wish I was there with you.
No, you don't. Well, thank you very much, Henry and Mark.
Sure.
This was really great. And the technology worked. Yay, technology.
All right.
Oh, very good. Thanks a bunch, and we'll see you later.
Sounds good. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.